I never get to go out, not really. Like, not to any place nice. My best friend Emma and I struggle to pay bills every month. Anything fancier than fast food is out of the question. So when we get the chance to treat ourselves to something more extravagant, we save up for months. We call it a roommate date, and it's the closest thing to a vacation we get. I'd never been to the Silver Screen Theater before. It was one of those fancy, high-end cinemas that had people talking around town. Tickets were expensive, and the snacks were even worse, but Emma and I were determined to go. We'd saved for weeks and had memorized the menu and showtimes before we even left the apartment. The moment we walked in, I was hit by the ambiance. The lights, the smell of popcorn mixed with something else, a kind of exclusivity that I couldn't ignore. We made our way to our seats, feeling the excitement pulse through us, when I noticed something strange. A woman, sitting just a few rows ahead with her daughter. I frowned. This wasn't the place for kids, especially not this theater. The tickets were almost as expensive as a nice dinner, and there wasn't a kid-friendly movie in sight. The kid was probably around 6 or 7, and her mother, completely out of touch, like she didn't even notice how out of place they were. Maybe I was just being judgmental, but kids and expensive places didn't mix. We took our seats and tried to ignore them, but the kid's behavior became more and more noticeable as time passed. Her loud giggles, her shuffling around. At first, it was tolerable. A little annoying, sure, but nothing worth making a fuss over. Then, the shrieking began. It wasn't a gradual increase in noise. No, it went straight from a soft murmur of laughter to a shrill scream that seemed to slice through the air like a blade. I looked over reflexively, thinking maybe the kid had hurt herself. But no. She was running down the aisles now, laughing like a lunatic, her voice piercing through the low hum of the theater. The mother didn't even flinch. Her gaze was unfocused, her body slouched in a way that made it clear she wasn't paying attention. She wasn't just ignoring her daughter, she seemed completely unaware of what was happening around her. I glanced at Emma. She had that look on her face, the one where you're trying not to blow up but you're about 2 seconds from it. The girl was still running, still shrieking. At one point, she knocked over a popcorn bucket, sending the contents spilling across the floor. The people around us started to stir uncomfortably, but no one said anything. The staff hadn't come by yet, and I couldn't bring myself to say something either. I didn't want to be the bad guy. And then, just as I was starting to forget about the whole thing, the kid did something even worse. She started screaming again, this time in pure rage, standing just a few feet away from her mother. The mother? Still completely oblivious. The little girl began knocking things off the tables, throwing cups, and, when that wasn't enough, pushing chairs over. I couldn't believe it. How could a mother just sit there while her kid was causing this much chaos? I stared at her, but she didn't look back. I took in her face more carefully this time. Something wasn't right. She wasn't just tired or spaced out. Her eyes were glazed over, like she was in some sort of trance. Pale, exhausted, but not the kind of exhaustion I knew from sleepless nights or stress. No, this was something else. I turned away quickly. Maybe it was better to just focus on the movie and pretend nothing was happening. I was about to take a bite of my popcorn when the glass shattered. The kid had broken a plate. That's when a man in a suit, one of the managers I assumed, came over to the table. For a moment, I thought maybe things would finally get sorted out, that maybe the kid would be escorted out. But as soon as he bent down to help, the kid screamed again. And this time, the scream wasn't just annoying. It was violent, unnatural. The manager staggered backward, his hand at his ear, eyes wide. I thought he was having a seizure at first. Blood trickled down his face, and he collapsed in a heap, his body twitching unnervingly. People in the rows around us started screaming. A few ran to help, but they too were overtaken by the sound. Blood poured from their ears and noses. Some dropped to the floor like puppets with their strings cut, and the girl was still screaming. I remember looking around in a daze. The theater was in chaos. People were collapsing. Others were crying out in pain. My own ears were ringing. The air was thick with panic. Emma grabbed my hand, pulling me out of my seat, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Come on, we have to go," she said, but the door wouldn't open. I pressed against it, frantic, trying to get out, but nothing worked. The crowd was still pushing at the glass doors, banging on them, desperate to escape. But there was no way out. I noticed it. The girl. She wasn't just standing there anymore. No, she was walking toward us, and everything in her path was moving out of her way. Tables, chairs, they slid and toppled as if she was commanding them. She was too close now. I could feel the tension in the air, the weight of something wrong, something otherworldly. Emma and I turned, sprinting down the hallway, trying to find another way out. The back door, maybe. But when we got there, we weren't alone. A crowd of people were packed into the narrow space, panicking. The screams were deafening now. And then the kitchen erupted in flames. A burst of fire shot up from the stove as if it had been ignited by the girl's scream, a wave of heat that engulfed anyone too close. People screamed as they burned alive, their cries adding to the symphony of terror. Emma grabbed my hand, pulling me through the fire, but it was too much. The heat, the chaos. I could barely see through the smoke, could barely hear through the screams. We made it to the bathroom, the only place with a lock. I pushed the door closed behind us, locking it. The bathroom wasn't safe. It was a trap, but it was better than nothing. We pressed ourselves against the door, but I knew it wouldn't hold. It wouldn't stop what was coming. I tried calling 911, but all I got was static. The silence outside now was even worse than the screaming. It felt wrong, unnatural. Then, I heard something. A faint sound, the clicking of small shoes, skipping down the hall. I squeezed Emma's hand, my heart pounding in my chest. It was her. And I don't think there's anywhere to run anymore.
The man walked toward the bridge, just as he always did. Under his arm, he carried a jet-black book bound in worn leather, and in his right hand, a dim kerosene lantern swayed slightly with his steps. His footsteps echoed against the wet asphalt, sharp and rhythmic, like the hooves of a restless horse. A girl sat on the railings, her bare feet dangling over the abyss, her dark hair barely shifting in the cold wind. As the man stepped closer, the flickering lantern light carved out her pale features from the darkness. She froze. He didn't ask her why she was there. He didn't say that things would be okay. He simply cleared his throat and spoke, his voice patient, steady, like an archivist reciting long-forgotten chronicles. "This bridge is cursed," he said. "Everyone around here knows it. They might not remember where the curse came from. Maybe it was always here. Maybe someone brought it. But one thing's for sure. This bridge does not like outsiders, and it does not forgive trespassers." The girl stiffened but did not move. "There used to be a stone pass here, built in 1892. They called it Grimsby Pass. The locals have a different name for it, though. Devil's Ravine. They say that on the day it opened, 3 children went missing. 3, all too young to be on their own. Their mothers searched every alley, every home. One of them was the pastor's son, another the pharmacist's daughter, and the third..." He paused. The third didn't exist, at least not in any record. But his mother remembered so well that one November night, she came back here and carved his name into the railing. The man ran a gloved finger over the rusted metal. You know what's strange? Every year that name changed. It faded, and a new one took its place. And the mother returned, every time, weeping, carving it all over again. Until one year, she disappeared too. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint gurgling of the river below. "You do realize the fall will kill you, don't you?" he asked calmly. "That is, if something else doesn't take you first." She clenched the railing. "Do you think you'll be the first?" The man chuckled softly. "Oh no, there have been many before you. In 1946, a boy no one ever looked for. In 1973, a woman who begged people not to let them inside. In 1999, two brothers whose voices can still be heard if you stand here long enough. They call out names. Can you guess whose name they'll call next? The girl didn't answer. Do you know who the last one was? He leaned slightly forward. The lantern light trembled. Peter Hall, a police officer investigating the disappearances. He didn't believe in ghost stories. Didn't believe that the bridge did something to people. And then, one rainy night, he came here. Something, or someone, snapped his spine in two. They found him 3 days later. His face was twisted in pure terror. The flame in his lantern flickered as if something unseen had exhaled. And the strangest part? When they found his body, he was clutching a piece of paper. It was covered in a single sentence. I heard her whisper. The lantern's glow cast deep shadows across his face. Peter Hall was born mute. The girl parted her lips as if to speak, but no words came out. The man tilted his head. Now, the real question is, will you hear her too? Somewhere below, something splashed against the rocks. A deep, gurgling sound, like someone taking a ragged breath after drowning. The man turned his head slightly, as if someone had just called his name. Through the gap in the metal beams, something gleamed in the darkness. Pale, featureless. The lantern light sputtered and died. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the darkness beneath the bridge came alive, shifting, stretching, climbing the concrete pillars like unseen hands reaching for air. The man knew that sound well. It was the brittle crack of joints, somehow popping back into place, after too much time, hanging motionless. I think it's time we step back. And slowly, as if moving through deep water, the girl climbed back over the railing, hesitating only once before her feet touched solid ground. The lantern reignited. And there, on the metal beam where her hand had just been, was something new. A fresh carving. A name. Her name. She stepped away from the railing, shuddering. The man nodded, snapping his book shut. He ran his fingers over its worn cover, as if checking for a new chapter. Far away, beyond the bridge, a floodlight illuminated the steel cross of a church steeple. The wind howled, carrying a voice that was not their own. And beneath the bridge, deep in the Devil's Ravine, something took another ragged breath.
The traveler had been walking since morning, and as dusk settled over the desolate stretch of road, she knew she needed to find shelter soon. She never took the highways, never followed the well-worn trails. The back roads were safer, for reasons she alone understood. She was tall, her frame wiry from years of wandering. Her skin was sun-roughened, darkened by exposure, and her unkempt brown hair was streaked with dust and sweat. Everything she owned fit inside a battered rucksack slung over her shoulders. She was content with that. Freedom meant never staying anywhere too long. She guessed she was somewhere near the Arkansas-Mississippi border, though the land around her felt like it belonged to neither place. The road was cracked, swallowed in places by creeping kudzu, the trees lining it so thick and gnarled they bent inward like watchful sentinels. Somewhere in the fog-draped distance, a river gurgled unseen. Tomorrow, she would cross into new territory. But tonight, she needed a place to rest. There were no houses here, no barns, no motels, only the thickening dark. She had slept under trees before. It wasn't the worst thing in the world. Then her foot sank into something wet and soft. She barely caught herself before slipping, stumbling sideways onto the loose gravel. A sharp, putrid stench of copper and rot curled into her nostrils. The mist around her wasn't thick enough to hide the shredded remains of an animal sprawled across the road. She crouched down, gaze darting over the remains. It was fresh, blood still pooled in the indents of the pavement. The body, a deer, or maybe something bigger, had been torn apart, not run over. Bones jutted at unnatural angles. Ribbons of flesh dangled like frayed rope. Something had ripped it open, something with teeth strong enough to crush through ribs like twigs. She straightened, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. No insects, no birds, just the distant murmur of the unseen river. She forced herself to move, to put distance between herself and whatever had done this. She walked faster, but the uneasy feeling of being watched crept up her spine like ice water. Twice, she stopped dead in her tracks, heart hammering in her ribs. She could have sworn she heard something moving beyond the trees. Not the small rustle of a scavenger, something larger, something pacing her. She didn't run. That would be a mistake. Instead, she walked faster, swallowing her fear. Then she saw it, headlights cutting through the mist, a rumbling engine growing closer. A voice shouted from inside, muffled and frantic. She hesitated. Then, thinking better of it, she raised her hand to flag them down. The van shuddered to a stop just a few feet away, and the window rolled down with an agonizing creak. A woman sat in the driver's seat. Her face was weathered, her short, graying curls half covered by a faded bandana. She wore oversized overalls, splattered with what might have been oil or something worse. A cigarette dangled from her lips, burned down to the filter, her wild, bloodshot eyes locked onto the traveler. "You idiot," the woman snapped. "What the hell are you doing walking out here at night?" The traveler took a breath, looking for a place to sleep. "But I saw something back there, a fresh kill, something big." The woman's expression didn't change. "You see anything else?" "I heard something following me." The woman sighed and rubbed at her temples with grease-stained fingers. "Figures. I've been looking for Rowdy for hours. Damn fool thing ran off again." "Rowdy? My baby, my pride and joy. Raised him since he was a pup. Took care of him, fed him right, made him special." Her fingers tapped anxiously against the wheel. "Tonight he got all fussy, didn't want to eat his supper. Spent all damn day making it just right too. Nothing makes me madder than wasted food." The traveler's gut twisted. "What exactly is Rowdy?" The woman let out a dry chuckle. "Oh, honey, ain't nothing else like him. Closest thing you might compare him to is a dog, but he ain't no mutt." A heavy thud echoed from behind the van. The traveler stiffened. The woman's grin widened. "He found you." Something slammed into the traveler's side with inhuman strength. She hit the pavement hard, pain cracking through her ribs, her breath ripped from her lungs. The mist swirled as a shadow loomed over her, and then the weight, the unbearable weight pinning her down. She screamed as claws raked through her coat, tearing into her skin like paper. The smell, hot, sickly sweet decay mixed with something fungal, something wet and mold-ridden, filled her nose as hot, reeking breath panted against her face. Then she saw it. It was twisted, grotesquely malformed, as if something had stitched together the worst parts of different beasts. It had no eyes. Where they should have been, two slits of puckered, scarred flesh remained, as though someone had deliberately sewn them shut. Bristles, sticking out from leathery, stretched skin, gnarled with bulbous growths. Its jaw split wider than it should have, revealing rows of ragged, irregular teeth, some too long, some jutting sideways, as if they had grown unchecked, warped over time. A deep, gurgling snarl bubbled from its throat as a thick, tar-like drool dripped onto her cheek, searing hot. Its front limbs weren't quite right, too long, the elbows bending backward like a twisted mockery of canine anatomy. Its paws, if they could be called that, ended in uneven, splintered claws, like shards of bone had pushed through the skin and never stopped growing. The last thing she saw before it clamped its jaws around her shoulder was the raw, pulsing tissue lining its throat, moving as if something inside was still alive. She barely had time to choke on her own screams. The woman stepped out of the van, watching with vague amusement. She shook her head, disappointed. "Rowdy," she sighed. "Ain't I taught you better?" The monster paused, lifting its head from the ruined mess of the traveler's body. Blood dripped from its jaws. Its stitched-over sockets twitched toward the woman. She narrowed her gaze and raised one calloused, trembling hand. "You go on and finish every damn bite," she said. "I didn't raise no picky eater."